big black swan for Putin that I can count in the last 2.5 years. One was getting pasted outside of Kyiv in February, March of 2022. Then in April 2022, the sinking of the Moskva in the Black Sea. Then last year, almost exactly a year from now, the warlord Yevgeny Prigozhin marches halfway to Moscow. And then this. I do believe the Russians are going to restore or are restoring order, but confidence still has to be shaken in the regime. A lot of the population, though very Russian and pro-Russian, are angry.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're speaking to retired Brigadier General Peter Zwack, former US Defense Attaché to Russia and author of the book Swimming the Volga. Peter, thank you very much for joining us again.
Thank you for having me. Important times.
And I thought if we could just start today with this strike this morning on Poltava in Ukraine. It's killed almost 50, we know at the moment, 180 injured, possibly more. Probably one of the deadliest strikes of this recent wave by Russia. Is there more Ukraine's allies could be doing at the moment to prevent these strikes?
They're doing a lot. It's never enough with the torrent of missiles and drones. And the missiles now, you've got cruise missiles and SRBMs, short-range ballistic Iskander missiles. And it's as much an issue of production as anything else. And the Ukrainians have done a very credible job in knocking a lot of this stuff down. But stuff gets through now. And somehow, Ukraine's friends need to help even more to amp up the air defense, especially medium range. The Ukrainians seem to do pretty well with their own organic things regarding the multitude of drones that get sent its way. And what is interesting about Poltava, what was interesting about Poltava is there's a famous battle, one of the famous battles in Russian history, 1709, where Peter the Great defeats the Swedes. And that really, really helps, if you will, create the Romanov traditional Russia. There's a lot of history now, Louis, in these areas that we're talking about, including Kursk.
Well, speaking of Kursk, of course, it's almost been a month now of Ukrainian forces occupying Russian territory in Kursk. How would you assess the impact of this militarily, but also politically?
I think that now it's settling into now a difficult, if you will, stasis. It's the bottom line here, friends, is that the Ukrainians, it's like fighting a heavyweight, lead-footed heavyweight prize boxer. The Ukrainians are nimble, they're faster. They saw a gap and they went in and popped and staggered much heavier opponent. Right now, what's happening is there seems to be some consolidation. The Ukrainians have captured a relatively large swath of land. And, we can talk about, the square mileage, but it's hundreds of square miles. And, but now you've got to hold it. Now you've got to hold the land on, fairly extended fronts, dozens and dozens and dozens of added miles. And meanwhile, they are in a Verdun Somme type battle in the Donbass, where the Russians continue to relentlessly try to take down Pokrovsk, which is one of the keys to Donetsk, to the towns of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. So this is another fight like Bakhmut was, like Avdiivka was, and it is a grinded out fight that the Ukrainians really don't want, because no matter how well you're fighting, you're going to be taking attritional losses, even though the Russians are taking horrendously more. So you have sort of the scales going on right now, and the scale is positive with Kursk, the Kursk operation, and if not, slightly negative, if not neutral, on the other side of Pokrovsk. The Russians see the Donbass as part of their fundamental objective of this war. These were two, Luhansk and Donetsk were the two of the four areas annexed in 2022. And I think that they are going all out. If there's ever going to be a negotiation from a Russian perspective, they want to have control of the four annexed, meaning we're in Russia, provinces that they conquered pieces of in 22 and a bit in 23. So it's a toss-up. Psychological effects, astounding what the Ukrainians did. It woke up the world that the Ukrainians are still in the fight. They've got moxie. They are fighting, and they're showing again they are fighting existential fight against a ruthless invader who's been at it now for over 2.5 years, and they're still in it. And they've taken their body blows, and they're taking really bad losses relative to the Ukrainian population. But that's the positive piece of it. It also shocked, and we've all been reading the reports, the Russian media, Putin couldn't control the Russian media on this, and the war bloggers. And it's all over Russia that the Ukrainians did this. Now they'll spin it in different ways and make it, this is all NATO backed and sinister and everything else. But the Ukrainians counterpunched hard. But now, I think that, and oh, by the way, it was also a message to the world, especially those countries, the fence sitters, who sort of kind of support Russia, but not entirely. And it also is very important for NATO and like-minded allies and friends of Ukraine that it is still worthy to support this nation that is in a truly desperate existential fight for its existence.
And so, as you've discussed, obviously, in your book as well, you lived in Russia for quite some time. Obviously, you spent some time there as a defense attaché as well, and visited Kursk. What can you tell us about Kursk and from your time there, and its sort of place in the Russian mentality as well?
Well, Kursk is one of the great battles in Soviet/Russian history. And it was only, 81 years ago. And in 1989, I was a Russian student, an American student studying Russian, and had gotten an opportunity to travel in Russia. This was a Soviet Union. This is a time when Glasnost was opening, and one could travel and go places you can't now. And I and a friend of mine decided we would go to Moscow, rent one of those little Ladas, looked like the old Fiat 128, and we put in paperwork, and we decided we were going to drive northern Ukraine, the Donbass, and our objective was Sochi. So we took this little putt-putt car, very reliable, through Western Russia, Oryol, and then we went to Kursk, and we went out to see the battlefield, the Tankovoye Polye, the famous battlefield of Prokhorovka, that if your readers or listeners look up, arguably the biggest tank-on-tank clash in military history. And this is all just 90 miles from what's going on right now. The terrain is revisiting itself. And we saw the monuments there, and it was a valiant battle by the Soviets. It really was the death ride of the vaunted German Panzer Corps, the tanks. And paradoxically, like we remember the Ukrainian offensive last summer that stalled so quickly, the Nazis waited 2.5 months to get their biggest, best Tiger tanks and equipment to the front. That allowed the Soviets to build a defensive line. And it's sort of a little bit like what happened to the Ukrainians. They had to wait because they needed more weapons and bigger weapons, and we dawdled, and it was difficult. So Kursk, it's steeped in history, monuments. You can go to Moscow, and there's quite a museum that has it in there, a big diorama. And it is militarily holy ground, and there were heroic things that happened on both sides of that battle. But the Russians really faced the Germans head to head and bested them. Now, what happens with the Germans at this time is that they are so all in to the Kursk salient that the Soviets launch counteroffensives on their flanks and basically caves in the German extent of the German advance. Now look what's happening right now. What happened before? The Ukrainians had to wait. They're now here. They have done this really remarkable incursion, offensive. I struggle with what to call it. Bigger than an incursion. And they have succeeded in gaining all this ground, put a lot of doubt in Putin. This is the fourth big black swan for Putin that I can count in the last 2.5 years. One was getting pasted outside of Kyiv in February, March of 2022. Then in April 2022, the sinking of the Moskva in the Black Sea. Then last year, almost exactly a year from now, the warlord Yevgeny Prigozhin marches halfway to Moscow. And then this. I do believe the Russians are going to restore or are restoring order, but confidence still has to be shaken in the regime. A lot of the population, though very Russian and pro-Russian, are angry. You've gotten reports from the Kursk mayor and the mayors from up on the front, Belgorod, that a lot of people are evacuating, and 100,000 what you call displaced. I wouldn't completely call them refugees. It's a big shock. So to close on this long piece, I think now the Ukrainians are in a successfully difficult situation because they have sent a lot of firepower. Now, firepower is relative. Nobody knows the exact number. 10 to 30,000 Ukrainians, a lot of ordnance. That's still a lot. Some were, and to get those forces stealthily in the area, backing up to launch the jumping off points toward Kursk was remarkable. And they came out of the Donetsk area. The OPSEC was incredible. And really surprised the Russians, though in the Russian side, apparently there were indicators the Ukrainians were going to do something like that. But once again, the Russian high command ignored the warnings. So now the Ukrainians are in a situation where throughout all of this, the Russians have not lost their eye on the ball, and that is the Donetsk. And that is Pokrovsk, They've just captured the little town titled New York. And we're hearing about other towns, and it's at what point? I don't think the Ukrainians can hold that bulge in Russia. I don't think that they will. They may pull back to more defensible lines to hold some of the ground, but extended the way they are, they're vulnerable. So there's going to be, I think, a shifting of forces all around. But it's a timing problem because the longer they're heavily engaged in the Kursk thrust, the more the Donbass front gets shakier and shakier.
And so, as you say, Russia is, in a way, now in something of a race to overwhelm Ukraine at Pokrovsk, ahead of winter. You know, given Russia's losses over the summer, as you say, they really have built up now. How important is it going to be for Putin to get this victory in Pokrovsk and come out of this fighting season with something to really show for that large number of losses?
Well, if it's just Pokrovsk, I mean, the Ukrainians have lost cities before. By the way, the fate of any Ukrainian city under attack by Russia is its annihilation, and I think the Ukrainians know that too. And I think there will be a bitter fight. In urban terrain, the fight favors the defense. The challenge for forces out in this land, in central West Russia, is it's pretty flat, and it's great tank country right now. It's great tank country, which has helped both sides, helped the Ukrainians too. I mean, they've pushed a lot of stuff up there. But General Mudd, as you inferred, will be arriving in 6 weeks, and that will really, really bog things down, especially for the attacker. And the question is, do the Ukrainians continue to do minor thrusts? Do they dig in? They've already been building some basic trench lines. In my mind, way too extended. Maybe that's set for the now, and they're going to pull back. And then the Russians, I think we've heard reports, they have sent formations. To the area around Kursk. The 82nd Air Assault Brigade. There are just a bunch of them, and troops from Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar, which is the other big city under, and what tips first? And if the Ukrainians want to shorten their line and then reinforce Pokrovsk, having made their point to the Russians and the world and their own people, I think that's probably the most militarily prudent option, that they do it in a controlled way. What they don't want to do is be out in this salient, this bulge, and then start having the edges of the bulge fall away. And then you get a major retreat, as they had to do out of Avdiivka. So it's touch and go. Ukrainians have done it. I see them consolidating their positions. They've got their air defense umbrella up over there and everything else. But the Russians are going to come in heavy.
And elsewhere, of course, there is another Ukrainian campaign that is continuing in the air as such, their drone campaign. just over the weekend, even Moscow refineries have now been targeted. Is that more damaging for the Russians economically or politically?
Oh, it's politically. It's certainly an irritant because while the Ukrainians aren't firing missiles, they are firing their drones or their missiles. They just don't carry particularly big warheads. And I still remember late in 22, the drones, and God knows where they came from. That one bounced off of one of the buildings in the Kremlin, and that was a shock. And the Ukrainians are homemade. Many of them, they're cheap, and there are a lot of them, and that they seem to be making up the deficit somewhat in artillery. You read the reports, even if the Russian reports are exaggerated, how many they've shot down. There are a lot of drones Ukrainians are flying, and so are the Russians doing so. They have their official ones, and they also have a cottage industry of that. That's, by the way, we're watching the nature of war change. And but you're seeing also how the heavy forces, the ground forces, are adapting to that, the anti-drone technologies and everything. But the drones are big. The cruise missiles, the Ukrainians with little time can handle them. They're relatively slow, but they're shape changers. They can go different directions. The short-range ballistic missiles, the Iskander types, are much faster, fired straight to target, and that's a harder burden for Ukrainians. Their missiles, and at that point, their missiles like Patriot and things like that, which they always need more of. I think they're going in for another set from Europe, but it's coin of the realm. This is what concerns me, is just think back the last few months, how much expenditure in ammunition, in shells, in air defense rounds and missiles are being expended, even with all the reinforcements of the last early summer. So I've got to believe that there's an urgent call to get stockpiles replenished, and that can, as we saw last year, make a defense very, very difficult.
And you mentioned, the imbalance with missiles in a way, and the strike capabilities. Ukraine obviously is pushing to go further and use US long range missiles to strike into Russia. They argue certainly that their incursion into Kursk has proven that Russia either can't or won't respond seriously to these attacks because of the Kursk incursion. But do you think the US is right to be more hesitant? Is there something more that Putin could retaliate with here?
Yeah, let me get to that. I want to say one thing about the missiles and the right to do so. How can the Russians call the Ukrainian attack, incursion into Kursk as a provocation? A provocation. What has been the last 2.5 years using those standards of merciless Russian fighting in Ukraine? Awful word. It's a provocation. Now the U.S., I think, has been very careful, sometimes too careful. I think at this point, the allowing the Ukrainians to strike beyond, if you will, the influencing lines of the military fight, going deeper to depots and rail junctions and things like that. I think the Russians have earned that. And then again, how dare the Russians say it's again a provocation or war crime when they're doing it across the breadth of Ukraine, all the cities. Poland had to scrambled some fighters yesterday. Um, yes, there are always threats, but Russians, playing that nuclear poker, that nuclear extortion, is sounding like an increasingly tired theme. Remember, the Chinese and other countries of that girth are supporting Russia, but does not want Moscow to use nukes. So there's a lot going in on it. It's a very, very dangerous bluff Putin is using, and we have to take it seriously. Because if we were to get it wrong, it's the end of the world as we know it, basically. Saying that, we can't allow that Russian perception of our perception to govern our reactions. Ukraine is fighting for its life. It's proven its worthiness. The Russians could make it stop, but they won't. And I don't think that they're going to stop until, I always use the word, they feel that they've made the Ukrainians submit, which is a medieval word, submit, more than defeating them, bow down to them as a nation. And by the way, then the nation doesn't exist. So the Ukrainians are, I think, absolutely right in wanting to do deeper strikes. I was cautious in the first year of the war, more. Well, I'm always cautious, but in the beginning, when the people saying we should have been using our big stuff or let them since day one, I disagreed. We didn't know what we were dealing with. We were a nuclear-tipped, revanchist nation had just made a gigantic invasion of a European country. It's threatening, and you're handling this cobra, and I think also talking to NATO really matters, and I think on most of these things we've got NATO concurrence. In some cases, NATO is even more potentially aggressive than we are. I think we're getting there. And this is an important time because the Russians are certainly pressing on Pokrovsk, and they're marshaling, if you will, there have to be counterattack forces in the Kursk salient.
So yesterday, Putin visited Mongolia, defying his International Criminal Court arrest warrant. Obviously, this time last year, Putin didn't attend the Brig summit in South Africa. Is that warrant still a diplomatic problem for the Kremlin?
Yes, it is. I think that they have to. First of all, it's an overriding mantra that he has in dealing in fora like the United Nations and all that, whether countries support it or not. He has to be selective where he can visit. Mongolia is fairly safe. I think that Russia shares a long border with Mongolia. Mongolia is not going to cross Putin and Russia. You go to other countries, and that risk is there. The variable, and if he can't 100% count on it, he's not going to do it. So he has done a fair amount of regional travel in the last year. Remember, the first year and a half, he was, he was Bunker Vladimir. He didn't move. So I think he has to pay attention to it. It's real, and as such, he won't overreach. The fact he didn't go to South Africa was telling. One of the BRICS, in theory, would have not supported the ICC, but there are a lot of ways that that airplanes can be escorted mid-flight somewhere, or overflight, or landing, and he's not going to go there.
Brigadier General Peter Zwack, thank you very much for coming on Frontline today.
Hey, always good to see you, my British friends.
Thank you for watching Frontline on Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine and other stories, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, download the Times Radio app and listen live to the latest stories, or read more on thetimes.com. Goodbye.